Hello everyone, and welcome to tonight's presentation of OTF Connects, using authentic assessment to drive curriculum with Garfield Jeannie Newman of the Critical Thinking Consortium. On behalf of Sirius Gurhan and the OTF Connects program, we're very thrilled to have you here tonight, giving up some of your own time to further your learning and the learning of your students. And we're always happy to have Garfield with us as well. Garfield has presented many OTF Connect sessions and done a great deal of other PD projects with the Ontario Teachers Federation, so we're thrilled to have him here, and I know some of you will also already be familiar with his work. We are especially excited that we've got teachers from all across the province, certainly along the southern and central parts of it, and we're also thrilled that many of you, or some of you I should say, are joining us via mobile device, which is a new development for Blackboard for us, and so we're thrilled to see you participating there. And a little reminder to you to interact with your screen periodically. After 5 minutes you'll be timed out of the session if it doesn't seem like there's any activity, so do keep your fingers touching that screen and stay involved. I am now going to hand things over to Garfield, and he can get things started, and I'll be available through the chat if you need any help. Over to you, Garfield.
Thanks, Louise, and I'll just make sure that my mic's okay. Louise, you can hear me all right?
Sounds good, Garfield.
Great, okay. So, welcome this evening. Hopefully everyone's doing well, and as the winter seems to start to approach. So we're going to explore a little bit around planning and using authentic learning, authentic assessments. Just a little bit of context. A number of years ago, I began presenting and talking about authentic assessments, and there's a fair body of research around authentic assessments. And it struck me a couple of years ago, working with some digital applications, that I wondered if we want to broaden our term or concept beyond authentic assessment and just to look at authentic learning. What are the opportunities that technology gives us today to frame learning in authentic ways, that the way kids access information, use information, create with information, it can be more authentic. So I think it's beyond what do they do with what they learned, but how they learned it. And so that's part of the reimagining the possible. And I just wanted to show you just one, and I'll try to explain. I just posted in the chat window there kind of a taxonomy of sorts in terms of thinking about authentic tasks. And so I'm going to suggest that we can move from fake, that's what I would, a unit test, a quiz, the kind of things that are typically done in school but never outside of school. Those would be assessments that we might term fake. And then we might have what we might call fake real assignments. So a fake real assignment might be, rather than writing an essay or a report, try to write an authentic diary entry from the perspective of a character in the past. So kids are doing something that's a little more what might have happened in the past, but it's not actually happening in their lives. So there's a simulation of sorts. When we move to real fake, the focus now more on real. It's a little closer to what goes on in the real world around us. But it's still often a simulation of sorts. So it's imagine you were doing this, or imagine you might be doing that. And I think where possible, our goal in authentic learning should be tasks that I would call real. So these are tasks that not just simulate, but actually have kids engaged in ways, launching an anti-bullying campaign in the school as part of a media literacy. How can we communicate and use visuals to communicate an important message for a real cause, like an anti-bullying would be an example. Or some of you may be familiar with Kiva. Kiva.org is a micro-lending site, and when we engage kids and let's see if we can make a difference in the world, select someone that you think we should sponsor with a loan, and the kids raise money in the school to sponsor an actual person. They learn about the country, in their social studies, and they loan the money, and they think about where to loan it next time. It creates what we would call a real scenario for kids. So I just want to set that up a little bit. Thanks, Louise. The microloans at Kiva. really interesting way to integrate math in an authentic, meaningful way for kids, social studies, and that's what I mean when we talk about we're starting to reimagine authentic learning in terms of not just how kids access, but the kind of tasks that we invite them to think about. So I'm going to jump past this page and look at, in that context, what I might define as 4 pillars that are often key to student success. One of those pillars is sustained inquiry, that kids are invited to inquire into something meaningful in their lives, or meaningful in their community. Student engagement is another pillar of success, that we want students to to be intellectually engaged, not just socially engaged, not just entertained, but engaged in deep, meaningful ways. Oh, sorry, I'm just watching that chat window. The third pillar for success, meaningful assessment, that students are not merely completing the task out of compliance, but they see value in the task, that the assessments yield important evidence about competencies that will matter in the future, and so on. And nurturing creativity, allowing kids to innovate, to think differently, to explore. So I wanted, and some of you, I recognize some names, you will have done this activity with me perhaps, but I'm going to start us off this evening just as a way to model some of the thinking that we might want to underpin. And I'm going to ask you, and maybe if Louise is available, she could set me up. If we were to vote here, what I want you to do is to decide, do these 3 images of transportation, sorry, I just want to see it. Okay, so it's not my end for the static. That's good to see. I wanted to have you decide, and you can either just type it in the chat window, or perhaps we set up a vote. I'll let Louise decide. Do these 3 images of transportation over time reflect almost no change over the past 200 years? Okay, maybe my plug for my earphones is out. Does it reflect a little change, some change, considerable, or dramatic change? So if you could just maybe just vote in the chat window by just putting you'll see behind the icons there's a number, 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 5. So if you could just, what do you think? Is there a dramatic change, limited change? Can you just give me a number? So see a 4 and a 5 and a 4. Okay. Great. Lots of 5s and 4s. Wonderful. If you voted, could you start just to the chat window, if you want to jump on the mic? Could you give me some evidence why you think that? So I see someone's checked considerable change, some dramatic change. Could you tell me just a little bit, just why do you think? Wonderful, thanks, Chris. So I see they're all on the ground. So you said a 3. They're still ground-based in this image. Could someone else type in their logical progression? Interesting. Okay, so that it's interesting to say that, because the first train in North America was actually a series of stagecoaches that were put onto a metal rail and hooked together. So you can see that. Moving forward. So Kelly, did you say that was a 4 then? Speed of travel, improvements in technology, how quickly we move, how many people we move. Okay, wonderful. Now, I'm going to show you another set. Here's a kitchen from 200 years ago, a kitchen from the 1950s, and a kitchen from today. Again, if you could do the same thing wherever you would like to place it, from 1, almost no change, 2, little change, 3, some change, 4, considerable change, or 5, dramatic change. Could you give me a rating there? How much change do you think? Okay, I've seen a 3, 3. Okay, so our scores are a little bit lower this time. Oh, down as low as a 2, and then a 5. Okay, wonderful. All women, all cooking. Okay. So, as low as a 1. Could I see a little bit of evidence as to why you've decided that there's been little change or moderate? This one seems, if I were to compare it, it's more moderate in the change. A lot of 3s and 2s and 1s, I think only 1 5. So what evidence would you use to support this assessment? The basics. The kitchen still serves essentially the same function. Okay. Heat sources are similar. Okay. Okay, so I'm seeing we might be a bit more efficient in the kitchen, maybe a lot more. Okay, So advances in the technology, but the purpose remains the same. Wonderful. It's interesting, the style and decor changes. I was in a fireplace store the other day picking up some bricks to line our wood stove. And I don't know if you've seen, but the stove you see in the bottom, they had a gorgeous reproduction of the stove on the bottom, but it was now a fully modern electric or gas stove, but gorgeous stove. I think it was $8,000 or something silly like that. Okay, one last time. Here's a classroom from about 200 years ago, a classroom from the 1950s, and a classroom from today. So if you wouldn't mind, one last time, how much has education or the classroom changed? And by the way, if you want, as I get into the evidence, you can cite, maybe my pictures aren't representative. So has the classroom changed dramatically or limited? It's interesting, we're getting a bigger range on this one than we did the first. Okay, and I'm starting to see some evidence that they still look like passive. Okay, so kids are still passive, facing the teacher. Aaron, you're saying some classrooms still don't look that different from the bottom one? Okay, wonderful. Now, I want to just, before we move on from this, and I just wanted to show you that by asking you, notice, had I asked you somebody to list similarities and differences, I wouldn't have required a judgment. So I just want you to, just as a strategy, by inviting you to make a judgment from little to dramatic change, it had you using evidence but making a judgment. And I just want you to notice there's so many ways we can do this in various subject matters with kids, just showing them images, inviting them to not just draw what are similar and different about it, but you think there's been dramatic or little change, and we just infuse a thinking opportunity for kids. But I also want us to start looking at, so to what degree has the classroom changed? And some of you noted there's way more technology, and yet others may have said, but they still look passively, that the tablet might be presenting information. So I think what this raises is some interesting and important questions about how that technology is being used, and is the pedagogy of the classroom changing, and what would that look like? Heather, when you say tablets, the new slate, I've often thought I'd like to get a T-shirt made that shows early humans with a stone tablet, and then the 19th century with the blackboard slate they would carry to the iPad slate, and just that the tablet just changes in its size, I suppose, but we're still in some ways doing the same thing. So that's what we want to explore. So I want to link those questions as we began to what's really different, what's not different. Share with you. This is from a book by Linda Darling Hammond. The book is called Preparing Teachers for a Changing World. So Linda Darling Hammond, Preparing Teachers for a Changing World. And at the beginning of the book, I believe on page 6, she cites a study that was done a few years ago about highly effective teachers. And what's interesting is, first of all, they found that, well, let me back up just a little bit. Highly effective teachers were determined by award-winning teachers who received high praise from parents, from students, from their colleagues, that in a variety of measures were found to be exemplary in their practice. What was interesting is when they looked at the collection of teachers identified as exemplary, they found that there's no one single way to be a great teacher. So, what was interesting is that some teachers were more storytellers, some facilitated more, but there was a wide range of ways that teachers were effective. There's not a single way. But they did find these 6 commonalities, regardless of the style of teaching. These are 6 things they found that all highly effective teachers seem to do. One, that they made expectations for the students. They were clear, and exemplars were provided. Students knew what they were to do, what their expectations were. They knew what excellence would look like. Secondly, you could find student work everywhere in the room. So you notice inside the class, out the door, down the hall, student work was always evident. Thirdly, teachers didn't stand still. I'm sorry, I'm just, Erin, I'm happy to have these shared. Louise has the slides, so I'll leave her to answer how we might do that, if that's okay. So the third piece, teachers covered, they moved about, so lots of movement in the class. Fourth, you'll notice lots of small group activities. Desks in rows almost non-existent in the classroom with highly effective teachers. High levels of instructional discourse. The students were being encouraged to ask questions, to discuss, to share ideas, so lots and lots of student discussion. And sixth, the organization, clearly evident. No wasted time as teachers went to get resources. Things were ready to go, so instructional time wasn't lost. Those are 6 things that they found that all the effective teachers shared. What I'd like you to do is just identify for me, and I'm going to break this into 2 parts. If you were to take from that list something that either in your own classroom or in general in your school, or if you're in a different capacity, your observations of teachers, if you were to pick one of those things that you think is particularly well done, what would it be? What would you say, you know, this affirms something for me. This affirms that what I'm doing is effective. What would that be if you've picked one that I do quite well, or my teachers do well, or teachers I interact with do well? So if you can just type in a number for me from 1 to 6, what do we do particularly well? So 1s and 4s, okay. Great. Okay. Let me flip my question, if I could. If there was one of those you feel like you could do more work on, that there's an area that I think I need to focus a little more, what would be the one area? So if we can now type in the number that would say, this is an area of further work for me. Interesting range. Let me just, as you're thinking, or you continue to jot that down, I'm just going to, and please feel free to jump in and add some comments. Just a few observations on my part. I think number one, I think one thing to remember around exemplars is exemplars doesn't mean exemplary, and I think it's one of the places we need to be careful that when bringing exemplars in, and one of my students who just returned from their practicum, you know, one of the observations they made today is that she was having her students create a map of their heart, I believe, about, you know, things that were important to them and so on. And they were grade 1 students, and she said, you know, the problem is when I showed an exemplar, she created one of her own, and this young woman's from Slovenia, and she said, you know, I would show them the map of my heart, and that was the model. And she said, I had a Chinese girl put Slovenia on the map of her heart because that's what she saw in mine. And so the danger can be that, you know, if kids see exemplary, if they see exemplars be exemplary, then they think they should copy it. So I think it's important. 2 things I would encourage. One is that we take a range of samples and have students think about which of these are, you know, from weak to strong and what makes the difference. And I love what you're saying here about taking work. I would also encourage, and remember our theme tonight is authentic assessments, don't limit our exemplars to work produced by students. That exemplars are all around the world they live in. Having kids, you know, do a poster, go to the movie theater and ask, you know, do you have any old movie posters you're throwing out that I can take into the class? And have students assess, you know, purpose and audience, you know, who this worked well for or not. Getting, you know, just taking flyers in that come in the mail and having kids decide which of these are effective and ineffective. Like, I think exemplars, we need to see them as on the world around us, not just student work. And so students have an authentic context to the work they're doing. I think number 2, I want to extend it. I remember the study came out a few years ago. I think we increasingly want to, think about student work is everywhere, including online. So instead of limiting now to the physical posting of work, when students can share their work and have a wider audience and get feedback. So I think that's an interesting notion to extend the view there. And lastly, I'll just touch on, you know, I think the instructional discourse is part of my lesson tomorrow with my students is going to be to encourage them to adopt, you know, one of the most simple strategies Think, Pair, Share is so underutilized, certainly by my students, that they just need to pause and let kids turn and talk to a partner to try to impress upon them that when you ask a question, and one of the comments I made routinely when I was visiting my students is that they would often ask a question and they get an answer from one student. You see, is the sound okay now? I saw the note there. Let me know if we're okay. Okay, thank you. So when I would watch my students, they would ask a question, and their check for understanding would be to post a question, and the student would answer, and they'd move on. And I'd have to repeatedly say to students, my student teachers, because one or two students answered your question doesn't mean the class understood it. It means one or two students. And in fact, the kids least likely to answer are the ones who probably most need to be called on. So part of that instructional discourse is just allowing kids, number one, just allow kids the time to turn and talk. And my second piece of advice to them is going to be, and when they talk, again, I found my students tended to stand at the front a lot while if there was discussion, just from purely effective assessment and teacher feasibility. What we want to help with kids, when I pose a question, my goal whenever I do a model lesson is to touch base with every student at least once in the class. So when I give a question, I say turn to an elbow partner, I'm going to go listen in on a conversation between two students or a couple of pairs of students each time, which allows me to garner feedback on observation, conversational data, which informs my teaching. So just, that discourse is not just time for kids to turn and talk. It's a chance for me to do an ongoing formative assessment that I don't have to take home and mark to figure out if there's confusion. I can figure it out on the fly. I want to show you one of the focus for tonight, looking at authentic assessment to engage students. So I want to show you, this is a Gallup study that came out in the U.S. last year, and I'll invite you to weigh in on this in a moment. But what they found in the study last year is that the longer students stay in school, the less they want to be there. So the number 76 you see when they surveyed students at the grade 3 level, 76% were engaged in the learning and enjoyed being in school. By grade 10, when the other end of the study, 44% of students were engaged in learning and wanted to be in school. So the longer kids are in school, the less they wanted to be there. And yet, and I raise this in a technology lens, we spend more and more money on technology, but is it just replicating the kind of learning that has disengaged kids? Because if technology was the panacea we want it to be, then we should have kids knocking our doors down to get into school. But instead, we have kids increasingly disengaging through the study. Now, this is an American study. So what I want to ask you, what do you think? Does that American study carry over into Canadian schools? Do you think we have what I've called here progressive disengagement, that the longer kids are in school? Or do you think that's a uniquely American problem? So Andrea, thanks for starting us off with a yes. So do kids become more engaged over time? And what might be some of the reasons that explain that? Because there will be, there'll be reasons that are beyond our control. There's all kinds of things in teens' lives that can complicate their journey, their educational journey. But to what degree do we bear some responsibility? Okay, so see, last year saying this is an issue we have, okay? Any thoughts that you might add as well, then, as you're saying that we seem to, okay, so thanks, Kelly. I was just going to ask, are there ways that you found or things that you think we need to be doing that could arrest this issue that we're seeing here? So first of all, I'm seeing topics that resonate with kids, okay? Honoring learning styles and interests. Okay. So I see relevance, responsibility. Lisa, I remember reading, I see your comment about having them read what we enjoy. I remember reading once about how many, I think it's gotten better, but in high school, how many times the novels selected and so on reflected a kind of a feminist perspective, because the English classes tend to be dominated by women, and how many boys were disengaging because they just weren't interested in Margaret Atwood and Margaret Lawrence, and they wanted something that represented their interests. So it's interesting your comment that about what we enjoy. Interesting. So social media, more short bursts of conversation, I suppose, with less depth to that conversation. Okay, great. Those are some great comments. Thank you. I think this is an issue we need to, we really need to explore how we're going to arrest this notion of disengaged students, and how do we turn it around. So we're going to explore this a little bit. And I'm going to raise this question for you. Are teacher avatars next? About a year and a half ago, I was traveling to Oman to work at a conference in Oman, and we passed through Dubai. And in the airport in Dubai, this is from an airport, the picture's I think in Frankfurt, Germany. But in Dubai, they had these airport avatars, and these are, that one was an Arabic man, and he basically, you can see it's a holographic projection, and the hologram is talking to you, the holographic projection is talking to you, and showing you what you're allowed to take in your carry-on. And I thought, wow, this is really cool. That gentleman is standing there telling me and showing me, and he's just a projection. And it struck me, and as I said, my student teachers often believe that their primary goal is they need to make sure they know the content. And I've said to them, so, if we're not careful, if we think content delivery is our main job, are teacher avatars next? Could we replace teachers with an avatar that stands at the front, delivers the lesson of content, and the kids fill in their worksheet? Now, I think that's not what a teacher's job is, but my students' biggest stress going out in the first practicum is, do I know the content? And they have an overemphasis on delivery of content. So love to just pause for a moment and get your thoughts on that. Like can we sustain the profession and justify teacher salaries if content delivery is perceived to be our main goal? And if not, how should we act differently? I'm just going to pause and give you a chance to respond to my thought. So, Aaron, you're entering into the subject area wars now by too much math homework. I'm wondering if anyone else is going to argue there's too much history homework. Too much homework. Michelle, that's an interesting comment about some of the institutional structures of schools, bells and 75-minute periods, and I think that's an interesting comment because it strikes me as the very industrial nature of schools that was were designed in the Industrial Revolution age. So interesting to push thinking around what might a school look like outside of that industrial construct. Interesting. I like that comment about more authentic assessment, hopefully, and co-op at a younger age. Interesting. Oh, Victoria, great comment. Avatars aren't capable of love, empathy, listening. That's exactly my point, that good teaching isn't about content delivery. That can be done by my phone. It can be done by the Khan Academy. It can be done by an avatar. I think this gets us at the core of what is at the core of good teaching. By the way, I want to add to this, and the reason I've posed this question to get us thinking about this is just to think about what is the primary role in the digital age. and a caution, because increasingly we're talking about inquiry, and I had a bit of a Twitter conversation with someone recently about the role of kids being allowed to wonder, and I want to just offer a caution. I agree we want kids to wonder, but I think inquiry has to extend beyond what are currently students' interests, and I say that because it strikes me that an important role of teachers is to inspire awe and wonder in children, to have kids explore issues and topics that they didn't even know about, that they come to school to broaden their horizon. And my fear sometimes is that as we try to help kids see relevance, it needs to be not just in their interests, but in things that they hadn't necessarily seen. So how do we help them see the relevance? I have a concern that a young boy who loves dinosaurs just wants to study dinosaurs. I think about my own education, the moments, those aha moments where someone introduced me to a new writer, a new idea, something I hadn't even known about, and it excited me. And I think so, and that's not to deny the role of kids wondering. I think that's great, but I think we can also turn them on to things. And the other comment I do want to make is that I think we have to, even when, and this is the danger with discovery learning, where we'll simply turn it over to kids and let them go on their own. We're seeing a lot of evidence that kids get lost and overwhelmed, that even when kids pursue a topic of personal interest, I still have an important role to play to help kids frame good questions, to help them think about how they'll make thoughtful decisions, to help them decide whether they can trust the resource. We have an important role in building the intellectual toolkit kids need if they're going to meaningfully engage through inquiry. Great, I love your comment, Kim, that content delivery should not be a goal. We teach them to think. Wonderful. Sorry, Aaron, I'm seeing your son drowning in the math. I think we've been there. Fortunately, my daughter loves math, so although I still think she felt she was drowning in it. Okay, wonderful comments. Thanks so much for this. Okay, let's jump ahead, and I think some of this we've started to touch on. I think my comments you've already preceded, so I'll just be quick on this one. It strikes me that we're at a crossroads in education. Technology is really challenging some traditional things we did, and there are wonderful advances in digital technology that can allow students, and this is the dichotomy that I see and the danger that I see, that either we're going to use technology to help children become thoughtful contributors to knowledge construction, so creating authentic context where kids think about and contribute to knowledge construction, or they're going to be thoughtless consumers of information. That to me is, and I do see at times that kids are accessing information more easily than ever, but they don't necessarily filter it, they don't necessarily process it. So at the same time that we have this huge potential, I think we also have a huge danger, and that is that misuse, digital technology just might reinforce kids as consumers of information, not thoughtful contributors. And to me, this is the challenge that we need to confront. Oops, sorry, this slide I forgot was supposed to come up in a variety of pieces. I'll talk through it. In this slide, what I want you to think about, and some of it's hidden a bit, that we need to move from what I would call a knowledge hierarchy to a knowledge network. And what I mean by a knowledge hierarchy, I think schools have traditionally been knowledge hierarchies, and I'll give you a couple of examples and then invite you to agree or disagree with me, and give me an example. A knowledge hierarchy, when the teachers assume that a teacher's lecture is true, so whatever the teacher said in their lesson must be true, so I'll write it down. That's a knowledge hierarchy, that the teachers hold some kind of truth that we impart and that students need to remember it so they can be tested on it. When kids assume that if it's in the text it must be true because it's been handed down from on high somewhere, it's a body of truth that got published and therefore we should accept it. Oh, thanks, Louise. Or another example, there we go, of a knowledge hierarchy is when we show a film to kids with a worksheet. So as you watch this film, answer these 10 questions. Notice the film is being shown as good science, good history, good whatever, and kids' jobs is to pull out information and record it. I would call all those knowledge hierarchies. The kids presume that the text, the teacher, the film, that there are sources of truth not to be questioned and not to be challenged. So let me pause there and just see if you agree with that statement, or you can disagree, or maybe add an example. I've given a few to start. Do you see the sense of schools as knowledge hierarchies? Is that how students perceive schools? So I'm putting that out as, so I see, Kelly, you agree with me. I mean, and I'm suggesting I think this is a significant problem, that if kids come in and they see or they believe that what they're told, the movies they watch. Earlier someone said, we're not teaching content, that we need to teach kids to think. And I think we undermine that by giving a worksheet with a movie, because they just assume that whatever's in that film must be true. By the way, interesting aside on that, as you're typing in some thoughts, if you ask kids which is more trustworthy, which is more credible, a Hollywood film or a documentary, what would they say? Yeah, so I think all of you are right. Kids will say a documentary is more truthful, and yet if you've seen Sicko by Michael Moore, he plays up Canada's healthcare system as almost flawless. He cites all the strengths of our healthcare system, and when he was challenged on that to say you've exaggerated our healthcare system, he said quite bluntly, yeah, and my audience was Americans, not Canadians. I'm trying to convince Americans to do something about their health care. So he didn't care that he had exaggerated or misled. That was a technique for him to make his point. I think kids need to question a documentary just like you would a Hollywood film. And my fear is that kids see it in the form of story and it's somehow less true. But if I make it a documentary, it's more true. Now, I think we want to shift to knowledge networks. So I'm just pausing when I see the comments. Heather, I love your term there. So I really like that the worksheet's a thought sheet. So instead of blanks to pull out information, using it to evaluate content, it's just wonderful. And I like your distinction, like a worksheet, a fill-in-the-blank worksheet versus a thought sheet that engages their learning. Now, when we move to knowledge networks, and Louise, if I get you to pull up the next piece, that would be great. I should mention, and some of you will know that I have made this comment before. What was behind that is essentially Bloom's taxonomy, and I, just to be upfront, in the Critical Thinking Consortium, we're not big fans of Bloom's taxonomy, and often I think for people that's a bit of heresy in education because we've all been trained in Bloom's taxonomy. We think it actually undermines thinking in classrooms because Bloom presumed, and he wrote this in his 1956 report, that we first impart knowledge and then we work on comprehension, and that like you work your way up to an evaluation. So what happens is thinking, or critical thinking, becomes the end part of learning. Now that you've acquired enough information and you've been able to develop the understanding, we can work on synthesis, evaluation, and revise Bloom to create. I want to suggest to you that the foundation of learning should be thinking, not the pinnacle of learning. That instead of, now that we've learned content, we're going to think about it. I want to start kids thinking. And that builds us to a knowledge network. But I do just want to pause, and Andrea, thanks for that. The house hip was a wonderful one. The other, if you haven't seen it, check out the BBC's 1950s, I forget, The Story of Spaghetti, which is a black and white documentary with a very authoritative sounding British gentleman talking about the spaghetti harvest and how good the harvest is. There's a couple of variations of this. I showed it to a grade 8 class in Ottawa, and 19 of the 20 students thought it was real. Only one of them began to question that spaghetti doesn't grow on trees. And it's interesting when you ask people, so why does this look so convincing? It's black and white, the British voice, they provide explanations for things. It's a great example. And by the way, it would fit as a documentary, as a short documentary. So yeah, fun one to look at. When we look at knowledge networks, we want to get kids to notice what I've got in the center, ask engaging questions. Notice what I'm doing is shifting from don't impart content to kids. Start with, you want to connect to their lives, their interests. Start with a provocative question that catches their interest. And then invite kids to reflect on what you already know and perhaps share that, or reflect and begin to investigate. Or reflect and based on what you know so far, begin your construction of a response. Go do some more investigation, share that. So notice what I'm trying to suggest here is a much more dynamic process for inquiry that launches, or I use the term launches, with an invitation to question, to wonder, and then has kids explore and reflect on and share and construct. So the driver for learning is this invitation to think, as opposed to the pinnacle of learning. And the last piece here that Louise had up, this is from a book called Too Big to Know by David Weinberger. And his book, Too Big to Know, the premise is that in the digital world, there's just way too much information for any one person to know. And so I loved his subtitle. He said, the smartest person in the room is the room. Now, this is a book about living in the digital world. So for Weinberger, the smartest person in a room, that room can be virtual. It's not defined by concrete walls. But his point being, as the world increases in complexity, the best chance we have to solve complex problems is to put our heads together, to share, to think together. So I love that notion that how do we free up and encourage kids to share their thinking. It's just I think an interesting notion, and it fits in with this knowledge of knowledge networks as opposed to knowledge hierarchies. By the way, just picking up on why I have a bit of a concern about Bloom's taxonomy, I saw this recently, Bloom's digital taxonomy, so a 1956 report, now 50 years, 60 years later, matched to, and notice that, and they set this up, not me, lower order thinking skills and higher order thinking skills. Now, I want to ask you, before I weigh in, take a look at the verbs at the bottom, listing, describing, identifying, and they add, those are the traditional, and then you see the digital terms, bullet pointing, highlighting, bookmarking, social networking, social bookmarking, and those are remembering, and they're thought to be low-order thinking skills. Now, does anyone have a concern that this is suggesting that social networking, highlighting, is low-order thinking? Let me just pause. Does that raise any red flags or concerns for anyone that we would propose that social networking and highlighting and others are low-order thinking? Andrea, can you unpack a little just for me? Why is that a concern? I mean, I agree with you, but I'd love to hear what your thoughts are. So let me just, so I love many of these comments that you're posting, and one of the ones I'll just quickly touch on, Andrea, that social networking is so complex. I mean, I have to tell you, as I have a daughter who's 19. It frightens me to think that we would help, or that we would presume that social networking is low-order thinking. It strikes me as a hugely dangerous assumption that to navigate social networking in a safe way is a very thoughtful task. I'm not sure, and I think I saw, so how would I know what to highlight if I didn't think through? So notice highlighting is put as a low order, but Lisa, you raised, but don't you have to be able to understand. I'd have to have a purpose, I'd have to understand the relevance, that I don't understand how someone highlights with low order thinking. So, by the way, I want to tell you just as a quick summary of this, I took all of these terms, the digital terms that you see on here, and I matched every one of them to one of the 6 ways that we work with in critical thinking to a critical thinking prompt. That I found it quite easy to show every single one of these terms is an opportunity for kids to think critically, as opposed to ordering them. And I'm not quite even sure why, in adopting this kind of digital approach, I'm not sure why we see Bloom's taxonomy as useful. We seem to feel the need to order these around Bloom, as opposed to recognizing that the digital world is a place that needs thoughtful engagement. So, Heather, I agree that highlighting without thinking is when almost everything in the text is highlighted. I saw someone once, I think it was a cartoon, where the student only had a black highlighter, so he crossed out everything and left a few words. But that's exactly the problem. We just highlight everything in sight. So I think one of the shifts that I'm getting at here as we look at authentic learning is, Chris, but by that, do you mean knowledge, understanding, thinking, application, and so on? Is that when you say the categories? Okay. It frustrates me, I'll put it that way. It's the ghost of Bloom hanging on tightly. I have yet to find anyone who can explain to me how students show understanding in the absence of thinking. I mean, I can recall information. I'm not sure how I demonstrate understanding but not thinking. I have had teachers for years say, I'm not sure I understand the difference between thinking and application. I have no idea how a child communicates effectively for purpose and audience and yet doesn't think about it. And I make this point because what we've done in our achievement chart, influenced by Bloom, is isolated thinking from the other areas. I would argue that thinking, if we truly value thinking, thinking should be it's the quality that we look for. So at a level 1 knowledge and understanding, students can recall some of the information. But at a level 4, children can be selective in the most credible and relevant information. That a level 4 communication clearly understands purpose and audience and communicates with clarity. So you see, I would argue that thinking should be taken out of our achievement chart and should be the difference between a level 1 and a level 4, right? So that's how I would respond to that the achievement chart is still Bloom's taxonomy. It isolates thinking as if it's separate from the others, and it's really the quality we should be looking for. And Heather, I agree. I think the limited, some, considerable are vague, unhelpful. We need to do some better work on that. By the way, those of you who teach high school, if you, again, want to see Bloom's taxonomy play, take a look at grade 10 academic history. Okay, if you take a look at grade 10 academic history, the overall expectations are describe, analyze, assess, describe, assess, describe, assess, analyze, and so on. If you look at the applied course, the overall expectations all begin with describe. So you'll see what we've done is we've said, well, in this course, kids should be thinking. We'll change the verbs, but in this course, we won't. So, it's a concern for me. Kim, just a quick thought. So you're saying that if we take thinking out and put it as a level 4, let me clarify what I'm saying there. What I'm saying is thinking is the quality and it attaches to all the other areas. So I wouldn't just flip Bloom on end. I'd be saying instead of seeing knowledge as low-order thinking, in the critical thinking consortium, we don't use the terms low and high-order thinking because, first of all, copying notes off a board, which is typically seen to be low-order thinking, I would argue is a thoughtless task. I simply blindly copy stuff. So really our distinction should be a thoughtless or a thoughtful reaction, a thoughtless or thoughtful task. And so knowledge is not low order. Knowledge is, do I understand? Can I select? Can I use it? So we would say that everything that Bloom has, by the way, Bloom's organization to help us understand the nature of our assessments is helpful. Is this asking kids to analyze? Is it helping kids to synthesize? Are they being asked to evaluate? That's very helpful. So do I know what my question is requiring? The presumption that some require more or less thinking is problematic. So I'd rather say, how do we ensure that all the things we do with kids invite them to think? Now, I don't want to get too sidetracked on that, but I do want to go back to my shift here, that we want thinking to become the foundation of learning. That's kind of the point I've been making. Rather than the pinnacle, rather than the result or the end of learning, now you have to think. Thinking is the starting point. And so, great suggestion for another webinar. So when we think about creating a thinking classroom, what we mean by that concept or that phrase is this is a classroom where kids, and I want you to note that kids learn to think and think to learn it. And what we mean by that is that in a thinking classroom, the way kids learn best is when we invite them to and engage them in thinking. So not to transmit content, but to get them to think as they learn new content. Notice I'm teaching content, but in a way that engages them in thinking. And in part, that requires that students are taught how to think. So we have a bit of a dual challenge before us. How do I teach content in a way that engages thinking? And how do I help kids learn to be good thinkers? So many of you will be familiar, I'll just touch on this briefly. How do we define critical thinking? It's problematizing the curriculum. It's finding a little tweak to put on the curriculum so that children are making thoughtful decisions. So, for example, if I presented 6 facts on a historical event, instead of saying to kids, here are 6 facts, copy them into your notes, I might say which 4 are most relevant and useful to us in the question we're trying to answer. So I've just problematized note-taking. So notice I can either say copy all this information down, or I can say copy 4 of the 6 down and think about which ones not to record. So we increase the thinking. Just as we build to the authentic piece, which I want to get to, we've come to the realization in the Critical Thinking Consortium that we really should talk not just about critical thinking, but about quality thinking. But thinking has 3 dimensions. It has a critical dimension where we make thoughtful decisions in light of criteria. It has a creative dimension in which kids innovate or generate new ideas or new possibilities. And it should have a collaborative dimension where we work in tandem or in concert with others. That good thinking, if we talk about a rich thinking classroom, has critical, creative, and collaborative dimensions. And rather than seeing them as different ways or separate ways of thinking, it's probably more productive and useful to see them as exactly TC3. It was more useful to think about, do we have quality thinking at play in our class that involves all 3 of these? That we don't want kids just reacting to, we want them innovating, and we want them working together. So there's the framework many of you have seen. I won't dwell on it. The 5 intellectual tools, just to touch on again though, kids cannot engage in meaningful inquiry if they have no background. They can't solve problems if they don't know about. So notice we do need to build background knowledge. How do we do it in a way that engages thinking? The kids need criteria to guide their thoughtful thinking. They need the vocabulary. Do I understand what an inference is? Do I understand what bias means? They need strategies to help them organize and make sense, and we need to nurture the habits. And Victoria, I'm so glad you picked up the climate to support thinking. Does my classroom reflect a place? By the way, I want you to note, if we go back to my concern about Bloom, if I want a thinking classroom, but many of my lessons first have kids sit and absorb information that I present to them before I present the thinking, then what we are creating and modeling for kids is sit and passively receive, and then I'll ask you to think. If we want thinking to be the foundation, it needs to be every day. It needs to be simply how we do business. Yeah, wonderful. I'm just reading the comment about Obadiah. Giving me a headache. Exactly. The challenge should precede the learning. If you want authentic learning, the task comes first. It's why I do the learning. So our task is not proof you've learned. Our task should be, you come to my class to learn to allow you to do this. So notice earlier, many of you are saying parents are demanding it, kids want to see a reason to learn. That will never happen as long as our task lies at the end of the learning. So no matter how authentic the task is, if I first impart content and then get to the task, you'll never get to that truly authentic place because the learning didn't take place to solve it. I want to show you just fairly quickly, when we try to develop overarching questions for authentic inquiry, I'm going to propose these 6 criteria that we think about. That these are 6 ways. So when I might look at, would this make a good overarching inquiry, my thinking here is that I place it in the center of the circle, and then I test it against these 6 criteria. Does it invite a reasoned response based on evidence and criteria. So the first thing, a good overarching question, a good authentic task that will engage thinking. Kids have to make some kind of reasoned judgment, and they have to use criteria and evidence to support. Okay. Secondly, it should invite a tentative response. Kids should be allowed to, take a stab at, to try out an answer, to speculate, and as they learn, they're going to refine their answer, add to their answer, so that a good overarching question, I use the term launches the learning, lets kids try out an answer, to speculate, to wonder. It should be iterative in nature. So as we learn, as we do a new experiment or a lab, as we watch a film, do a reading, we're going to return back to that question and see if you've changed your mind. Do you want to add to your answer? Do you want to refine your answer? So not only is it tentative, you give an initial, but we will, every few days, we're going to return to that. Quick example, my daughter in their first year biology course last year at U of T was shown a video on cellular processes. And she was asked the very first day, how many cellular processes can you find in this video? A few times throughout the course, the professor paused, showed the video, and said, now how many can you find? And at the end, the professor showed the video in the last class and said, if you really understood my course, you would have found 16 cellular processes. I thought, what a lovely way. Kids had a tentative answer. I think I can find 3. Each time they learned a bit more, they would revisit it. They'd say, hey, I think I found 2 more, and so on. And they just went back to that question. I think great overarching questions transcend the particular topic. So how can I take what I've learned in math, and science, and social studies, and history, to be generalized so that I can think about, if I want to think about British treatment of the Acadian people, I want to be able to generalize that into what does fair and just sound like? What does that look like? So we can learn from the past, we can learn from current issues in ways that I can apply more broadly, so that that authentic task has a broad learning for me. And in that sense, it should be generative, my fifth one, that it should spawn other questions that lead to other lines of inquiry, that you've got me thinking about it, now I need to explore this. And lastly, a good overarching question should be arguable or generalizable. Arguable in many subjects. So, you believe this, I respectfully disagree, I would argue this, and we can argue it using evidence and reason. That is the term generalizable for math. In many cases, math does have a correct answer, and I can't really argue the answer. But I can generalize the answer to say, so what does that tell me? What do we learn from this that would allow me to apply it in other contexts, or allow me, like, what's the rule that's emerging here, or what's the generalized pattern that I'm seeing here? So those are 6 ways, or 6 things that we might think about when we try to frame that overarching question for an authentic task. I'll just very quickly touch on this piece. This is simply a page I use with teachers to say, let's look at a sample question from the ministry curriculum or something from a text. And if it doesn't meet, so I'm going to back up, if that question does not meet, so let's say you plugged your question in, a textbook or your ministry question, and you found that, it really isn't meeting these questions. Then I would go here and say, okay, it's not working. Here are 5 common issues that often are the problem when we try to create a good overarching question. So sorry, let me just pause. I'm just looking at Victoria's note here about many right ways. And I want to add to that I would argue in all subjects, but in particular in this math context, that our interest should be less about the correctness of the student's answer and more about the justification or the reasoning. So a very quick primary example. If I were to ask what's 4 times 4, I'm sure all of you quickly go, oh, it's 16. And if I asked how did you know that, you'd say memory. That's not a critical thinking question. 4 times 4 is 16. It's important that you can get it right, but more important, what's your reasoning? So, yeah, exactly, Victoria. What's your mathematical thinking? So if I went back to the student and said, are you sure? I think you might be wrong. Can you show me that 4 times 4 is 16? How would you prove that to me? That's a thinking question. So our interest in history, in English, in science, and math is on the soundness and the reasonableness of an answer, not just the correctness. My 5 quick ideas here. If our answer is too factual, the kids just have to assemble information, I have on the left some suggestions or strategies that you can use to tweak it. Sometimes our questions are too convergent. The design of the question directs students to the answer they're supposed to arrive at. I find that a common one, especially in English and language arts classes, where we might ask, how has the author made effective use of irony in the story? Oh, I have to agree that they did. That's a convergent question that I've been told what to believe, and my job is to go find evidence to support an answer that's already been given. So I've suggested some ways. If you find a convergent question that's really directing kids to the expected answer, these are some ways I can open it up. Or sometimes questions can be too tangential. This is especially dangerous as we get into authentic assessment, and I see it particularly in science and math. And what happens is we ask an interesting question on a math topic, or it includes math, but it's really not getting at the math. It's really getting at something else. Or we lose sight of the science. Kids are to design a crane that can lift something, and it should be stable, and so on, and I include visually appealing. And kids end up putting all their time into how nice it looks, and we lose the science. So we want to be careful our task doesn't, when we create authentic tasks, that we don't have kids creating wonderful videos in a history class that has really lost sight of the history. But it was a good video. If our questions are too specific, how can we generalize them so they have more transformative power? And sometimes our questions are just too predictable. It's just, that answer is too obvious. It's not really a thinking question because I know the answer. So how do we open up those kind of questions? All right, let's move forward. These are the 6 prompts that many of you will have seen. I'm going to jump by them. So 6 ways we invite critical thinking, where we critique something in light of criteria. We decide which of the 2. We judge 2 or more. We rework something. We decode by using clues to come up with a reasonable answer. We create something in a design to specs that meets a set of specifications, or we perform in a way that meets criteria. So as we shift into think to learn and learn to think, I said earlier, and don't you just love this picture? I just love this picture. I said this earlier, so I won't spend the time. I just think one of the important roles we play as teachers is to create this kind of look, even if it's on the inside of a teenager, but it's just to inspire that awe and wonder, to get kids to see the wonder in the world and to want to engage with it. So it's not just focusing on what am I already interested in, but opening up new worlds. And I used the concept earlier of engagement, and we've been working in the consortium on a new, as you can see, a conceptualization of what we mean by engagement. Too often, in our view, engagement it refers to time on task. It's often, if I observed your classroom and I noticed that kids were always engaged with your task. They've engaged coming from the French word to commit to. They're always working on the worksheet as assigned. We would call that a low level of engagement because they may simply be compliant, that I don't want to get in trouble, I want to keep my marks up, I want to get the homework done so I don't do it at home. There could be a number of reasons I comply. As a level of, we see each one above subsuming the one below. In other words, if kids are more interested in learning, they're more likely to be willing to do the task. So I'm more likely to have kids complete tasks that they find interesting. I'm more likely to find something interesting that I see value in, that I understand why it's useful. I'm more likely to see value in something if it's a puzzle for me to solve. Now I have to say at this point though, I could come up with lots of critical thinking tasks that kids don't see value. So I want to say to you, don't lose sight of the bottom couple. This is really important. I might show a movie that I know my kids love, but I realize I really didn't challenge them to think about it. Or a field trip that kids really enjoy this field trip, but it's more entertainment than thinking. I don't want to lose the film, the field trip, the activity. I want to find a way to tweak it to give them a challenge, because if I can increase the challenge, I'll increase the depth of their engagement. And where possible, I want to have a transfer. I want them to think differently about their world. So I'm going to. I think I might jump by this just for time, but I'll give you the reference. So I'm just going to jump ahead just to show you. This is from the movie Pay It Forward, but I am watching our time. So if you've watched the movie, if you can recall it, and if you hadn't, it's worth watching. At the beginning of the movie, the teacher gives kids the challenge of coming up with something that will change the world. They have to do something that will impact the world. And I just show the clip and ask, what's the potential engagement level? Because you're only seeing the very first class. Is that below the level, non-compliant? Is that are kids going to comply? Are they interested? Thanks so much, Louise. Do they see value? By the way, I think when you watch the clip, you will see that he may have set it up in a way that didn't quite hit the level that we might want, but with a few tweaks, it could be at a level 4 or 5. And so it's worth looking at just to say, so interesting, but notice that's why my A question, what's the level of potential set out by the task? And then how could we increase the level so that kids have to be thoughtful about it? And one of the things I'll just point out before we move on from an engagement lens is that critical thinking, the 3 C's I showed you earlier, critical, creative, and collaborative, all play at the top level of that engagement. That if you want to engage kids in deep thinking, I have to get beyond, by the way, notice the math lesson that I tell you, you'll need this one day, it'll be important to do whatever task. I'm convincing kids that my lesson's valuable and you should pay attention. So I've got the care level. I could teach a fun lesson that kids are interested in, but neither of these lessons have challenged kids to think. So what we want to do is say, how do I build on interest and appreciation of the importance by challenging kids to think and use and apply that? So now I want to shift. So what would that look like if we use authentic challenges as proof that learning has occurred? So notice my suggestion. I'm looping back to something I said earlier. Imagine if our classrooms, that engagement, that higher level of engagement that we want, is through authentic challenges that kids engage with the challenge as the route to learn rather than being proof that they've learned. So what we want to flip upside down is my task is not proof you've learned. My task is the engagement. And I wanted to show you this, and I'll tell you why I have this in. I had some teachers I was working with outside of Calgary, Alberta, and after a few days of working together, they said, we've noticed that when we ask you a question and helping to frame a curriculum, you seem to drift off somewhere, you go quiet, and we notice you kind of stare at the ceiling, and then you rejoin us and you have a really interesting idea. So they said, we've been starting to look at the ceiling to see if we can find the spot that you're looking at to see if we can get the idea. And I hadn't realized I did that, and a little while later, I guess I was drifting off again, and they kind of chuckled. I thought, I guess I do stare at the ceiling. But what I want to do is to figure out, can I help teachers find the spot on the ceiling, so to speak? So where does my mind drift to? And it led me to a creative thinking strategy, which is referred to here as BVSR, which stands for Blind Variation Selective Retention. And the idea is that in blind variation, you want to generate all the ideas you can, and in selective retention, which have the most value. So if you said to me, here are some expectations I need to address in the curriculum, what might be an interesting, authentic task we could do? I realize that there are essentially 6 ways that I try to generate an interesting, authentic task. And I've set them out here, that I think about what might kids create. So could they design something? So something original, something useful in my subject area. A poster to advertise a toy, a product, a solution. That what might kids create? Sometimes I might invite them to recreate, so rework something. So take something that already exists and think about it for a different audience, for a different purpose. So give them a starting point and say, what might you do with this? Curate. I love this notion that people have used having students as curators of knowledge. So what if we had kids curate? So they could create, they could recreate, or they could curate. When kids curate, they gather together selection. So sometimes we might say, as you explore this, I want you to select the 10 best pieces you would put in a museum exhibit on great innovations in history. I want you to put together an exhibit of powerful indigenous art. We're going to look at a variety of pieces. I want you to create an anthology of great poetry, of great short stories. Anytime we ask kids to collect items and decide which ones are best, you're asking them to curate. And there are so many opportunities for really authentic ways for kids to to design, create, showcase their work ideas, and to showcase it for real audiences, for parents, for other people. That's a wonderful, authentic opportunity. Writing for purpose and audience. So using a particular text form and a particular audience and purpose, think of the different ways kids can write to get us beyond reports and essays to more authentic writing. A performance. What might kids do to entertain, to persuade, to educate others? And to imagine differently, and I want you to say it's different than recreate in that I want you to come up with an imaginative response to a problem, could be an old or new problem, by putting a twist on how we might have looked at things. So one example is Johann Gutenberg invented the printing press when he decided to combine a wine press with movable type. So essentially, he took two old ideas and combined them to imagine differently, and he came up with a new idea. So sometimes we might invite kids, take something that already exists, take a few things. If you combine them differently, use them differently, can you come up with another way? Now, my chart here is to say to teachers, see how many, here's a particular task, you're trying to come up with an authentic task, see how many different ideas you can generate, just brainstorm. And so we fill in as many boxes as we can. Step 2, this is the selective retention. So you've got 5 or 6 ideas you've generated. Which best meet these criteria? Which will provide a meaningful purpose for the learning? Which will engage the kids, knowing their interests, what matters to them? What will get at the competencies I need kids to develop, whether it's research or analysis or communication? Which will invite innovative thinking and risk-taking and encourage kids to be innovators? And which will give me the evidence I need to assess curricular outcomes? Now, this may help me take 6 or 8 ideas I generated and narrow it down to 2 or 3 that best meet my criteria. So that's just modeling a creativity strategy, generate a bunch of ideas, apply a set of criteria to narrow the ideas to try to arrive at the most useful, the most feasible, and so on. So here are some sample authentic tasks, and I'm going to pause and ask you to start in the chat window, adding a bunch that you've used. I'll just talk to a few of these. My last field trip before I left the classroom a number of years ago, I was teaching an ancient history class in grade 11, and I told them the very first week of class that their challenge is a month from now we're going to the beach to build sandcastles. And their challenge was to pick an ancient structure that they believed was important to that, to a particular ancient civilization. They had to research it and then go to the beach. We went to the beach early October in Toronto, beautiful stretch of sand beach. They had 4 hours to build the most impressive and accurate reproduction in sand that they could. At the end of the 4 hours, we invited the media, so CTV came, local newspapers came, and the beach was covered in Epidaurus, the Greek theater, an Aztec pyramid, a Roman bath complex, the Great Sphinx. Now, I want you to note, and this is important, an authentic task. Being a good sand sculptor is not in the history curriculum. It had nothing to do with what I wanted to assess. Remember I said this is my first week. I wanted kids to learn how to find useful resources, how to ask good questions, how to develop a set of notes that are useful and accurate and credible, how to collaborate with others to pull this off. The sandcastle was it was simply the hook. It was the thing that had the kids excited. I was using this to help kids build their research, questioning, and so on. I've adapted this for formerly grade 5, now grade 4. In the winter, they go out and they use snow and they build snow sculptures of ancient sites. But notice they have to justify why is this an important site and how do you know that you've done an accurate job. So it was around that. Creating a commemorative project for a past event, creating a life box. We had kids in New France, they were assigned a character, and you have to put in that box items from childhood, from adolescence, from their marriage, from later in life. If you were to create a collection of items to go in a box that could be handed on to your descendants, what items would you put in that would tell me an important story? Kids created the artifacts and little notes to include in it. Oh, Andrew, the Genius projects are wonderful. Yeah. Create a board game using your curriculum. I don't know if any of you have played Cranium. Great and multiple intelligence-based game. I would play Cranium with kids in the first week. That's the way I got to know my kids. I would see who had, as we played a game of Cranium, I wouldn't even know their names yet, but I can tell you I knew which kids were linguistically strong, which really liked to perform, which were artistic. And then we said to kids, your challenge is to recreate Cranium for grade 9 English, for grade 11 science, for grade 8 geography, whatever it might be. So each unit, kids had to write a series of 5 questions or tasks or activities that would fit each of the 4 boxes in Cranium, and we would test them out as our review for the test. And by the end of the year, we had, grade 9 geography Cranium that kids would play. So it was, kids really loved the game element. They learned how to write good questions, write good multiple choice questions, writing a movie review. So writing, that involves a thesis because you have to decide. You give it 2 thumbs up, 2 thumbs down, but it helps kids structure. Travel brochures, writing a children's story, so putting characters on trial. By the way, my wife used to put an ideology on trial in high school. She would put capitalism in an economics course. She put capitalism on trial, and she put communism on trial. I've seen, people put bottled water on trial. Right, or the automobile, greatest invention of the 20th century, or the greatest polluter of the 20th, and you put it on trial. Publish a magazine, get kids to do full color. Each of them play a role in production, but they also have to contribute a poem. They have to contribute a feature article. These are just a handful of tasks that engage kids in writing for purpose, engage kids in conducting research to help solve a problem. Notice in all of them, my task always comes first. So let me just pause for a moment and see if there are some other ideas that people have used or have heard people use that could add to my list. I'll just pause for a minute or so in watching our time. But do others have suggestions for interesting, authentic tasks that your kids can do? Andrea, what grade did you have them create the body systems? That sounds fascinating. And Victoria, I don't know if you're familiar with, but check out the website called Flocabulary. It's a website in which, and you can go to different subjects, but Flocabulary has like Shakespeare or great other works of art and so on, but done to hip-hop. I had a student once do a task of students. The header would decide whether the Simpsons episode in which I think they did Macbeth, or the hip-hop song remained truer to the original text. It was great because the kids had to actually read and understand the original text, and then they debated whether the Simpsons or the hip-hop song did a better job, which I thought was wonderful. Oh, I love the healthy eating. Very mock trials, public service announcements, great. Thanks so much. These are really, really helpful. And I think I'm hoping that the chat window is available to you after this as well. I think Louise can confirm because you guys have some fabulous ideas here. Oh, I love that. I had worked with a group of teachers in Alberta. Their challenge was grade 6. The students had to design an alien that could survive on a green planet like Earth. And so right off the bat, the kids started to design their alien, and as they learned about the various organs in the body, they would be asked to look at your alien, and does it have what it would need, and if not, how would you add it to it, which I thought was such a fun. And the kids had a blast. They built their aliens, and they had to show how the alien could survive on Earth. Wonderful. I'm getting a little nervous because I see that I'm at slide 37 of 88, so better see how far we get, and we can always arrange a session 2 if necessary, I suppose. Now, I want to add to, so I started earlier, a few slides back, saying imagine if we used authentic assessment, Imagine if we use authentic assessment as a way to gather, to have students engage with the learning rather than be proof. And now I want you to imagine if that inquiry driven by it was sustained over time. So that instead of simply, we teach content and then we give kids the project at the end, what if we go the other way? And let me show you, and you may wonder why this slide pops up now. Can I ask, could you just type in, if you've played any of these games, which one? Maybe you could just type in, if you've played them all, you can tell me that. If you played Angry Birds, who has played one or more of these games? So it looks like many of you have played some of these games. Here's what I want to touch on to link into our authentic assessment. When I was doing some research for the book that we published, I was particularly interested at the time with Angry Birds, and I did a little research and found out that Angry Birds. Oh, sorry, Melanie. I'll just back up as I talk to you. Is this the one you want, or is it the next one? And then I can talk while I leave it up. The next one. Okay, there we go. So when I did some research, I found that Angry Birds was played 200 million hours a year around the world. At its peak, 200 million hours of people spending time launching those birds at those pigs. And what I was intrigued by is, what is it about Angry Birds that gets people to invest so much time in the game? And what can we as educators learn from the success of games? So it's not to say we should all be involved in gaming, but it is to say exactly gaming theory and gaming strategy. How do we incorporate that in our teaching? Because they know something that is powerful, and I think we need to pay attention to it. That something became a little clearer to me. I was in Madrid presenting at a conference in Spain, and the keynote, it was a brain research conference, and the keynote speaker before my keynote was speaking on sustained attention. And she pointed out that sustained attention connects to the pleasure center of the brain, that we are more likely to pay attention to something in the pleasure center of the brain if we see value, relevance, it's useful in some way, that we tend not to pay attention to something that we see no value, no use, no relevance, I'm not interested. So this evening, if I'm saying something that resonates, that's useful, that you might be able to use, you are more likely to pay attention. I'm glad to see somebody saying, yes, I'd like more of this. So something must resonate, have value. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter connected to the pleasure center of the brain. So when you get a shot of dopamine into the brain, you have that sense of satisfaction. You feel it's a pleasure, and so on, and it causes you to want more. We like the pleasure center of the brain when activated. We'd like to get some more of that. Now, I often point out that coffee is a natural dopamine booster. People, watch almost any coffee commercial. People take a sip of coffee and they have that look of satisfaction. That's the dopamine rush. Chocolate is a dopamine booster. If you're feeling drained, often many of us will crave a piece of chocolate. It's a dopamine boost. What was fascinating is when she pointed out that another major source of dopamine is being successful at a challenge. And I have to point out, and we have some math people in the room, but I'll parallel this. I want you to know, if you gave me 30 math questions, and I did 10 of them, and they're easy, I get it. Doing 20 more might be helpful in just the practice, but I don't get a rush from doing multiple questions that I already get. Yes, I'm being successful, but I'm not challenged. I might get bored. Filling in a worksheet that has me transfer information from a film or a textbook in a history class, I'll be successful. I can fill in your worksheet, but you haven't challenged me. You haven't got me thinking about it. The flip side of that, you give me those 30 math questions, I do the first 10 and they're all wrong. I've got everything wrong. I want you to know you don't get a rush from repeated failure. That you give me a task in dance and drama and sport that's beyond what I'm capable of, I'm more likely to be frustrated. So what the research suggests from around the pleasure center of the brain, students need to be successful a minimum 20% of the time if inquiry is going to serve as a dopamine booster. So notice earlier when I said even when kids are going to work on independent inquiry, if the teacher isn't supporting helping them be successful, kids are going to get frustrated and overwhelmed, and they're not getting that dopamine boost. So what we want to be able to do is to give kids that chance to get that rush. And let me show you what that might look like. I'm just going to do a couple more pages, and then we'll stop for the evening. I've been kind of alluding to this, and I want to bring it home more clearly now. Take a look at language often used in schools. We talk about assessment tasks, summative assessments, culminating tasks. All of them suggest that our tasks are done so that kids prove that they've learned what they were supposed to learn. In other words, notice the language that a task is a demonstration that you've learned what you're to learn. It's not the reason to learn, it's proof that you've learned. I want to suggest that we should make the task the invitation to learn rather than the result of learning. So what if we set up our authentic tasks as a way that got kids thinking? And I'll show you what I mean by that in a moment. My wife in her grade 9 applied math class would always start with tips. She said, I start with the tips questions because that's what, and then the kids said, well, we don't know how to solve this. Of course you don't. That's why you come to class. And every day we try something, we'll go back. Now, how would you approach it now? Notice, we're going to figure out a way to solve this. That's why we come to class. So the task invites the learning. And I argue that teachers are choreographers of learning. So instead of facilitators, which I think is too limiting, I think teachers choreograph. We do more than just facilitate. Sometimes we step in with a teacher-directed lesson. Sometimes we set up a reading. Sometimes we coordinate a small group discussion, individual support. But I think the important role of the teacher is to choreograph the learning that will move children along as they need to be moved along. And what does that look like? So I want to just touch on, and then we'll stop, this notion of inquiry versus sustained inquiry. And the distinction is that the power of inquiry, the true power of inquiry, is not in the asking of a single question, as you see on the screen here, but the sequencing of questions, so that we invite kids to wonder, to speculate about a question, and we invite them through a series of related questions to explore issues and come back to that. And I'll try to show you an example. And this will be a good place for us to pause. This is what I call a cascading challenge, framed as an authentic task. If children are invited, or you, if we have a deep understanding of ingredients, could we use that to help us create innovative, healthy, and tasty menu for restaurants? So that's our question. We want to inquire into how can our understanding of ingredients help us to create better menus. The challenge, day one, plan and cost an innovative menu for a new restaurant. I want you to note if I was teaching this in a culinary class, and I'm using this as an example, and you can think within your subject, I would ask kids right off the bat, okay, no pre-teaching, you guys have a chance to open a new restaurant, what's on your menu, okay? And kids will start to jot down things they like, and by the way, it might be what they like, and they have to estimate a cost, what would you charge for it. They set aside their menu. The first line of inquiry that we're going to explore, the focus inquiry, how can we pair our ingredients to create the best menu? Your job is, in this line, develop a plan for pairing foods that will create maximum flavor and nutritional value. So kids have to, in a lesson, so by the way, as you see this, my top two boxes are my big unit question. Okay, this is going to take place over the next 2 or 3 weeks. The bolded boxes below might be a week's worth of learning, and the ones below, so the 3 blue, are my lessons. So today we're going to explore how we pair oils with other items to create health. Kids have to learn about different oils, their properties, and so on, and decide. They think of the next day we're going to learn about chemical reactions. Then we're going to learn about, as they learn these things, I keep taking them back to you. Remember that menu you drew up for me last week? Take it out. Would you change, add to it? Now that you've learned more about oils, for example, how would that alter your menu? As we move across, okay, so you've got a menu that's beginning to evolve. How are you going to make sure that we handle it safely? Do we need to change anything? So the kids work their way through. Then they have to think about pricing. By the way, notice each of the step of the way the kids are revisiting that iterative notion. They're going back to that menu they'd set up, and they're deciding what works. And lastly, they think about preparation. Now, we're past 9. I notice lots of people need to leave. This is where we could pick up, if we'd like to set up a follow-up, and just look at how do we take those authentic ideas and create what we would call a sustained inquiry approach. How would we, so that kids are excited about, but we scaffold the learning. So that's where I would see us going. We could pick up at this slide and have you bring ideas and start kicking them around. So I want to honor people's time. I'm going to stop there, and I'm seeing lots of yeses, so I'll leave it up to Louise. Maybe we can coordinate a time that would work for folks, and we could explore further the concrete measures to planning out an authentic inquiry. Good. I'm so glad to see that more would be helpful, and that's good. So I'm going to have to stop there, and hope everyone has a great night, and we can connect. And yes, Kelly, I think probably it's enough to think about, and maybe we can get out some of the key slides. You can mull them over, kick them around, and come back with questions. That'd be great. And in fact, I'm going to say to you, if there are questions, and you can send them to Louise that you'd like addressed, I can tweak the other slides as well to respond to questions that you might have that you're excited about but need to get some feedback. So that would be wonderful. So thanks, everyone, and have a great evening and a great rest of the term.
Thank you so much, Garfield. That was a really rich session, and there's always so much more that we can talk about, especially once everyone in the room starts sharing all their fantastic ideas too. So thank you, everyone, for that as well. On the screen right now, we've got the big orange Google link. Here's your feedback survey, and I'm going to drop a couple of links into the chat here. The first one is the resource page for tonight's session, so that is already up and running. The recording link will be on it tomorrow morning, and then there is the feedback survey link is there as well, and the calendar. So we do have quite a few more sessions, including one with Kyle Pierce on Thursday that talks about math tasks and engaging students by making things relevant for them as well. And tomorrow night is financial literacy, which is also about making things relevant to students. So we've got a lot of tie-in with a lot of topics discussed tonight. I do want to let you know that feedback survey, we really do appreciate your feedback, and we have heard what you have asked for, and certificates are now available for live participation in OTF Connect sessions. And when you get to the end of that feedback survey and click submit, the very next screen will provide you with a link to a page that will help you generate a PDF certificate that you can save or print for keeping. So please let us know if you have any problems with any of that, and those of you that are on mobile devices, you can give us some feedback around how that worked for you tonight. So thank you, everyone. We do hope to see you again soon, and thank you, Garfield. We know we will see you again soon, and we will talk to Siri about the potential of planning a part 2 to continue on from where this session left off. So thanks again, everyone.